about the significance of Confucianism in early China and why it was so important in terms of the way things developed.
Yes. We must distinguish between Confucius and Confucianism. Confucius lived around 500 BC, and I think we can say he was the first person to gather a group of disciples around him that passed on his teaching as a private person, and his teaching was basically suited to the circumstances of 500 BC. Confucianism, however, is something that is created at the beginning of the imperial age, 2,000 years ago. And although the name of Confucius and some of the texts associated with his teaching are used in that, it's a rather different kind of thing. It's a philosophy teaching people how the whole cosmos and the human world are all tied together in a great pattern of order, and everybody will do well to keep to their place in that. And of course, the people who study those texts from the Confucian school, most of all, they're the ones who have the power and the duty to teach everybody how to keep their place in the universe, and therefore are the ones best fitted to help in government.
Right, so in terms of the practical implications that it had on the people of China, what did it do to the social strata of the society?
I would say that Confucianism doesn't so much affect the social structure of China as is an expression of the social structure of China, one in which human relationships come first. One works from the family and the order in that out to the order of the rest of society. And certainly Confucianism is the mode through which people express their feeling about the necessity of a certain kind of social order, a hierarchic social order in which we all know our duty to those above us, in which children know their duty to their parents, ministers know their duty to their ruler, students know their duty to their teacher, and of course there are reciprocal duties as well, duties to those below you. All this we have to remember, though, these very hierarchical ways of thinking about society go in parallel with the way most ordinary people have always organized their lives, which is a series of horizontal relationships which enable you to survive living in this supposedly very hierarchical world. If you know somebody who is working in a particular ministry at a relatively low level, there is often much more use than making, say, a direct approach to the minister through the proper channels, which may well be blocked or never lead anywhere. Trust works horizontally, even though power moves vertically.
Now, in terms of the vertical power structure, could you just explain what that means in terms of comparing it to Europe and the sort of lack of middle class in China?
Two big differences, I think, between the structure of society in pre-modern China and in Europe. For a start, in China, there was no aristocracy of political importance, no hereditary nobility that holds political power in, say, an equivalent to the House of Lords. So there are princes of the royal blood, but they're not important. The real governing power, apart from the emperor, is exercised by the scholar official class, who are recruited by and large through examinations in Confucian classics and in Confucian ideology. So that's one great difference. Another difference is that although there are many rich merchants in pre-modern China, and although the government is very careful from time to co-opt them into society by giving them things like honorary official titles, there is nothing like the municipal power of an organized merchant class that you see in something like the City of London today, of course, and in previous centuries. So there is no class of essentially a bourgeoisie that intervenes in history independently. That does not happen in pre-modern China. That's an important difference because it was the contact between a bourgeois merchant class and craftsmen in England from the 17th century onwards that is one of the important things about what happens in the run-up to the scientific revolution.
And was there no alternative to the bourgeois class that could have created a scientific revolution here? I mean, can you imagine? I mean, obviously it didn't happen, but I mean, why not? Why couldn't the Mandarin class have generated that revolution?
Who can say what the alternative ways of making history are? All one can say, I think, is what did happen or what didn't happen. But one of the things about China that makes one feel that it's not perhaps the most favorable place for having a scientific revolution is the great centralization of the late empire. So, for instance, you can have the Kangxi emperor himself being interested in science, but if he decides that a particular bit of science or mathematics is not something he wants to pay attention to, that is quite likely to make sure that it makes no further progress. Whereas in Europe, not only are there within any given European kingdom quite a few alternative centres of power, but as well as that, there are rather a lot of European kingdoms. So if your ideas don't take in Germany, you can go to France or you can go to England. There really isn't anywhere else to go in late imperial China other than the imperial system.
Perhaps you could just describe the selection process of becoming a Mandarin and whether or not anyone could become, the very most senior Mandarin closest to the emperor, or whether there was some hierarchy within the system.
Anyone who wanted to could enter the examination system, so long as they were not, shall I say, of the criminal classes or of certain very delimited grades of people and so on. In practice, there was no point in entering the examination system unless you had at your disposal the resources of leisure and money in order to be able to start on your studies. Sometimes poor people did get through the system, but it's usually the sort of people who'd had officials in the family before who might be going to try it. The pyramid of success, however, is a very, very flat one. You enter the system at a broad base by taking the examinations designed for young boys, for instance. Fine, not too difficult to pass those. But by the time you start talking about the level of examinations that you take at the provincial level, the failure rate is very high indeed, and your chances of actually getting to the top and becoming a Jin Shi, that's a presented scholar, a scholar presented at court in Beijing, which will give you an entry into the high ranks of the administrative class, those chances are very small. So one might ask why people keep on entering this examination system when the chances are they're almost certain to fail. It's partly because, of course, the idea of coming out top the list in the capital examination is very tempting, there's lots of glory in it, but also because you need to have the lower degree level qualifications somewhere in your family if you are to maintain your family's gentry status. Because if you don't have those, you're subject to corvée labour, you're subject to corporal punishment, you won't be allowed to have direct access to the county magistrate and so on, and you'll be shut out from a whole network of connections, horizontal connections with other degree-holding gentry members, which is essential to your family's social and even economic survival. So the examinations play those two roles. One, for ultimately selecting members of the civil service, but in another way, for co-opting and authorising members of the gentry class.
Can you just describe what it would be like to take one of those examinations? I mean, how much stress the person would be under, what the kind of questions, I mean, what would it actually be like?
I think that the stress of taking the official examination was certainly very high indeed. It depended a great deal on memorization, certainly. So you were expected, if you were presented with a mere fragment of one of the texts you were supposed to have been studied, to recollect whole chunks of it, certainly. However, it also tested intelligence and ability to think fast under stress, because you were supposed to, in the course of, say, a day's work shut away in your examination cell, to be able to produce an essay, in some cases, that was not only dictated very heavily in form, so it had to be in 8 sections, each of which linked into the other in certain specified ways, but in some cases even a fixed number of characters. And although it seems to us a very artificial test, it was very effective in finding people who were highly determined, highly intelligent, and could think straight when they knew that a lot depended on it. It's probably a good way of selecting a generalist official. We mustn't forget that in Britain, too, in the 19th century, when civil service examinations were first adopted in place of selling jobs, one way that you could get a job, say, in the high civil service was to demonstrate your skill in composing Greek verse. Because the sort of people who went in for these examinations, having had a public school education, university education, may well just have studied the ancient Western classics in the same way that their Chinese colleagues would have studied the ancient Chinese classics. So it isn't too strikingly different, really. It's just if we compare like with like, one pre-modern society with another.
Perhaps what isn't still quite clear is this merchant class that obviously has the money but lacks the power. Now, wasn't there any way that with the money they could be a creative force in some way? I mean, why couldn't they function in the same way that they perhaps did in Britain and other European countries?
What merchants did do by way of using their money to make a contribution to society was very largely by patronage of the activities of scholars. For instance, there are various private academies, so-called shuyuan, that were founded with merchant money and certainly became famous centres of scholarly thought. But the merchants themselves suffered, at least formally, from laws designed to keep them at a social status well below that of the scholar gentry, and their only hope of advance was in actually their family members becoming members of the scholar gentry, and unless they did that, there was no way that they could have a voice in political affairs. As merchants, and as merchants alone, their job was to engage in business and to pay their taxes, and they could be subject to a huge amount of arbitrary official power, amounting effectively to random confiscations of their wealth by various either punitive means or else informal gifts being enforced.
Why did the government make these? Why did it enforce this rigid sort of restrictions on the merchants?
The Chinese government has always been concerned that there would be some alternative centre of political power developed, and we have to remember that its task was quite a considerable one in keeping the country governed with a really very small number of people, so that in a typical county the only directly appointed central government official might be one magistrate, who obviously would hire local staff. If you're trying to keep things working and calm like that, you don't want to come up and find that a group of merchants in Suzhou has in effect formed themselves into a political party to put pressure on the local government. So the process of co-opting merchants and penalising them from time to time if they look too rich and independent was one that Chinese governments have followed certainly for 2,000 years and continue to follow quite successfully up to, of course, the present century, when you do find that there begins to exist for the first time a national bourgeoisie, as it was called, based at first on the treaty ports and later spreading over the rest of China.
And some devolve power to the municipal, to the regions as well. I mean, what was it, how much? I mean, that's what, you know, because wouldn't that have been in some way? You could see the advantages of allowing that increased municipal power.
At the end of the Qing dynasty in 1911, many people were not just looking for an end of the imperial system in that they would have a president instead of an emperor, but quite a lot of people who'd had the experience of much greater local autonomy in, say, the last 50 years of the 19th century, when the power of the central government had in many ways collapsed under the impact of rebellion and other crises. Many people were saying, why actually do we need to have an empire at all, in the sense of the whole of this large area with so many diverse peoples in it being all governed from Beijing? Quite a lot of people said the provinces have in effect been running themselves, not just politically and economically, but also in effect militarily for decades. Can we not in effect become a Chinese federation? But that lost out. The heritage of unity and of a feeling that we all belong together under one centralized government was at the time too strong and has remained too strong, which is why, of course, the Chinese government feels so very firmly that it can't allow people in Taiwan to say that they are a separate country. That's almost blasphemous.
So, asking the question that I know you don't like, I'm going to ask it anyway, which is about, you know, to what extent you feel that this political structure that existed here was you know, one of the key reasons the Industrial Revolution didn't happen here.
No objection to that at all.
Okay, well, explain that. What? I mean, just summarise that thought.
Let's think about the effect of China's tradition of unity on the possible developments of science and technology. I think we can best do this by looking at a contrast. If you look at a man called Song Yingxing, who was active in the early 17th century, he writes a book on science and technology and laments that no one's going to read this book because it's got nothing to do with passing the official examinations, and he had no other real career open to him other than that of passing the examinations. He eventually got involved in local education. If you compare that with his contemporary, Georg Bauer, in what later became Germany. The man who wrote a book on mining called De Re Metallica under the name of Agricola, he was able to move from country to country for a start, and also from one kind of job to another. He practiced as a doctor, he taught Greek at a university, and he also became involved as an entrepreneur with mining. All kinds of roles opened to him, all kinds of places. The point is, there were many more possible points for diversity in Europe from the 16th, 17th century onwards, and therefore, since change often comes from the margins, many more boundaries to cross and many more margins at which one could carve out something new. So I suppose if one insists on making a broad contrast, one could point to that sort of effect.
Right.
I'm always reluctant to believe that the nature of the Chinese writing system, which seems so difficult to Westerners, can really be a barrier to literacy in itself, apart from other social factors. Because if you look at the country that has the world's most difficult writing system, the one most unsuitable for its language, you go to Japan, where they use not only Chinese characters, but also two different kinds of ways of writing syllables. And Japan has, I think, the world's highest literacy rate, which I think just shows human beings can learn to use any writing system fluently. Also, when we think about the past, when we find that people can't read and write, we shouldn't necessarily think that was any disadvantage to them, any more than it is a disadvantage for you and me in living our lives that we can't write computer machine code. Many people had no use for reading and writing at all in their lives. We tend to assume that if you're illiterate, you must be a write-off, but it certainly wasn't the case. By and large, people who find reading and writing useful find ways of learning to do it, certainly, even in a limited way that enables them just to keep the accounts of their business. There are, for instance, in China, there are special books, say, giving all the characters that a fishmonger would need to know, from 100 different kinds of fish and so on. That's all he needs to know. He doesn't need to be able to read the ideas of Confucius. He has no intention of sitting for the examination, so no problem. And of course, in the West as well, craftsmen, until quite late, would find nothing in written sources to help them do what they wanted to do, because literate people had no experience that was useful to them. So I think we should not make too much about the question of different kinds of writing and its effects on people's lives and social development.
Well, let me ask one thing, though, because I think there's one area where it did affect, and that's when you get into the sort of mass production of text, printing.
Yes.
I mean, surely and then you do get a situation where, you know, just the difficulty of having movable type with Chinese characters and so on, and on computers and leading up to the modern day. So when you're talking about kind of mass-produced letters, then it's more of a problem, isn't it? Could you discuss that?
Yes. The different writing systems in China and in Europe certainly affect the way that they print books when they do. All you need is a couple of dozen or so letters to do minimal printing in Europe, because you just need the letters of the alphabet. Obviously you want capitals and so on and so forth. Basically a trayful will enable you to do some printing. In China, you might need several thousand to print the characters that people are commonly able to read. And so you can see why quite a lot of printing in East Asia is done by making what you might think of as a lino cut of a page. You take a block of wood and you carve on it the characters that you want to print, so that you print the whole page in one go. In China there was movable type, however. In the 11th century it was invented there, certainly. And in some parts of Asia it was used quite a lot, in Korea for instance. But that was because in Korea the economics of book publishing was different. In Korea printing tended to be done in large runs, so people would print many hundreds of copies of a given book and then not print that one again. And in that case it's useful to be able to take the type apart and put it together again. In China typically the wood blocks would be kept on deposit and books would be printed more or less as and when one wanted a few dozen of them.
But isn't that the point? The fact is that it's kind of that they kept it to just a few books, and therefore there wasn't that sort of massive, wide range of books available. I mean,
I think one must be careful not to assume that in Europe, the minute the Gutenberg started printing, Europe became book rich. For a start, the Gutenbergs went bankrupt, which enabled someone else to make money by buying their plant. But also, manuscript production remained important in Europe for quite a long time. Books were expensive things, certainly not the sort of thing that everybody could manage to read. That didn't come until technical improvements in printing considerably later. In China, if people wanted books, they could get them as much as they could get them in Europe, and certainly considerably earlier. It was the widespread availability of printed books that enabled the Chinese Empire to make such a success out of its examination system, because everybody could be expected to get the set books.
Yes, but if you looked at the exponential growth of titles available in Europe and China, I think you'd see a very different graph.
I think I'll point there to the way the economics of book production works in East and West. This is an important point. In China, producing the book is a really cheap affair. You could do it without a great investment. You just need to get somebody to write the book out on paper. You paste the paper on a woodblock, and then a workman, with some skill maybe, but basically just a lowly paid workman just carves it out. There's the block. In Europe, on the other hand, they're using metal type, which has to be cut to quite high precision to make it fit together. And they're using an oiled ink, which requires high pressure on the paper. So a European printing press is a much more high-tech thing that requires a much greater investment of money. Now, if you've got one of those, your investment will force you to produce as many books as possible and try to search out markets. In China, you're not under the same pressure because you haven't got a capital investment. It's almost too easy to produce the books in China. You're not facing, like the Gutenbergs, the threat of bankruptcy if you can't get enough people to buy your books. So printers in Europe actually went out to try to find people to write controversial and new and useful books. This did happen in China too, but there's nothing like the same life or death pressure to do it. So I'm sure it's just the sheer necessity of the technology the printers are using in Europe that forces them into this desperate search for new markets, which of course does drive up book production and drives up readership, which hence drives up the demand for more books.
And the spread of knowledge and the spread of technical knowledge and so on.
Well, certainly so. The idea of telling people that, look, I've got something useful to tell you is a very, very good pressure for the printer. If the printer can persuade people that they will do their jobs better if they have this technical manual, that's fine. And that, no doubt, helps the printer to find a way of building up a market, simply.